Welcome, Mr. Stango. I have you on here as a human rights expert who currently chairs the Italian Federation for Human Rights. And I believe last week you've been to Turkey, to Istanbul, to observe proceedings in a terror trial, in a surreal terror trial, if one might put, about 41 defendants who were accused of terrorism for merely attending daily activities and associating with their peers. I would like to your point of view, how did it transpire and your view of the issue?
Yes, as you said, I was there to observe 3 days of sessions of hearings of this trial that has been come to be known as the girls' trial, because among those 41 defendants, there are many girls and 15 girls who are minors. They are less than 18 years old. And it was quite surreal because they are accused of such serious crimes, such as belonging to an armed terrorist group. But all that is possible to see from the acts of the documentation, the questions that have been made to the defendants and so on, is that they were knowing each other. They were usually doing common social activities. Some of the girls were sharing an apartment in order to study together or to be close to school or university. They used to go together to other activities such as having dinner, or sometimes they use even to read the Holy Quran or to pray together. All these would be classified as a terrorist activity. And when I saw how the trial was going on with the president of the tribunal, the senior judge, asking such questions like why you call your friend, why you met with your friends, and the answers were exactly what I mentioned. It looked like something not based on fact, any fact that can really justify the indiction for such a serious crime.
As a human rights expert, you must have encountered countless cases of violations by courts, by states, and you've seen a lot. What makes this case unique in your eyes? What stood out?
Yes, one of the main special cases is the fact that many of the defendants are so young. Another case that this trial has in common with what happens in authoritarian regimes, not in what should happen in democratic states, is the fact that the prosecution, the accusers, were evidently on the same side of the judge. So the judge didn't look, to my eyes, as a third party in the trial, a person that should be listening to the defendants, to their lawyers on the one hand, and to the accusation, to the public prosecutor on the other hand, and resume what he would have listened, taken into exam, and take a decision. The appearance was that the tribunals, the judges that had to take a decision, were on the same line of the prosecution. And this is not that is in line with what a rule of law state gives, because the defendant, according to the best juridical, is innocent until fair trial doesn't show that the defendant is guilty. So there is the presumption of innocence. I didn't have the impression that there was the presumption of innocence on the side of the tribunal. Maybe it was just my impression, but even the fact that the public prosecutor representative was sitting on a high chair at the same level of the judges, while the lawyers of the defendants are sitting down. This is something that, from a visual point of view, shows that the defendant and the prosecution are not on the same level.
Yes.
And this doesn't look very fair, you know.
Yes. Were you able to contact, talk to, or listen to any of the defendants or their lawyers?
Yes, I spoke with several lawyers. I noticed how professional they are. I spoke with some of the young defendants. It was impossible to speak with some of the defendants that were brought to the court by the gendarmerie because they are
Under arrest.
so it was impossible to talk with them. But I spoke with the young defendants that are not in jail in this moment. In several cases, they look very nice, even I would say very, very sweet persons. What is common for girls that have nothing to do with armed terrorism. Yes. Probably the only arms, the only weapons that they saw were the weapons of the police when they have been questioned, and also I noticed during the trial that in some moment they were intimidated. Imagine a student who is maybe years old or just 18 years old questioned in a tribunal in such a serious trial by a senior judge in a way that I saw, at least in one case, that pushes the girl to cry.
Yeah.
So this sort of intimidation doesn't serve justice, in my opinion.
Yes. Yes, I see. And did you, from lawyers or from any of the defendants, their stories about being interrogated by the police back in May when they were detained in police raids?
Yes, and also I read many documentations of the case, and I noticed that in some cases the young defendants were suggested or even forced to testify against their relatives, against their parents. So this is something that read in the documents of the trial, in what the defendant said to the lawyers and so on. Of course, this is a serious issue and should be, in my opinion, investigated. I'm not a judge, so I cannot give a judgment about this. But if this happened, this was against the law. So
yeah.
To force the defendant to be listened as a witness and to give a witness against or that can compromise his or her own parents is again something unfair. As far as I understood, some of the young defendants, the minors of age, were also interrogated on the 7th of May, kept up to 16 hours at the police station without possibility to speak with the lawyer and without a proper comfort, let's say, of a psychologist for
yes.
minors during the interrogation. I understand that the minors have a right to have a proper, specialized psychologist to assist them during a police interrogation, and apparently this didn't really happen, not in every case. Mm-hmm. So it is something that probably was not regular.
Yes. And what I want you to finally briefly on is, if you're familiar with the crackdown in Turkey that especially reached to unprecedented levels after the failed coup of 2016, are you familiar or well-versed with the situation? What would you have to say about this?
I am familiar with the situation, at least on a general level, and in detail with some specific case. Why it is impossible to be familiar in details with all the cases, because there are thousands and thousands. 15 of July 2016, there have been so many thousand cases that is very hard to have a proper examination for human rights defenders of each of them. But in some cases, I read all all about the case. We even presented as Italian Federation for Human Rights, FIDU, that we presented the so-called third-party interventions at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg,
Yes.
to support the instances presented by some of the persons that have been imprisoned with such accusation as supporting a terrorist group or belonging to terrorist organization, just because, for instance, they had a personal bank account in a bank or something like this. I know that even some lawyers have been accused of being terrorists just because they were the lawyers of some that was investigated or that was a defendant in such cases. I know that journalists have been trialed, have been sentenced against. I know that human rights defenders have been investigated and so on. So my impression, and in general, even the impression of the international human rights community, is that too many cases have been conducted in Turkey after July 2016 in a way to put in prison thousands of people just to show that there is a strong will and a strong power to do so.
Yes.
This is at the level of impression. Then at the level of the Supreme European Court, the European Court of Human Rights, there have been very accurate, although lengthy trials that took into account all the cases. They listened also to the lawyers of the Turkish state very carefully, and a number of judges, independent judges from many members of the Council of Europe, a number of judges decided that Turkey didn't act fairly in these cases, in violation of specific articles of the European Convention of Human Rights. So on the one hand, there is my perception, and it's possible to say, Antonio Stango is wrong. Yes. Although I have some 40 years of experience in this field. But on the other hand, we have the European Court of Human Rights with specific, very detailed sentences. And I suppose that Turkey, as well as Italy, as well as any other state, should respect the sentences of the European Court in Strasbourg.